So now we will start with the first topic of the day. So this is about an initiative to integrate the bamboo craft of Medar community into global market. So in this case, the Medar community is known for the bamboo craftsmen, and they do a lot of bamboo crafts. So here what they are doing is that there is an NGO that's called as Industry Foundation, and with the help of this NGO, these the Medar community bamboo craftsmen, they are now crafting things so that they can even reach the global brands and global markets like the IKEA. So with the help of the National Bamboo Mission. So first the thing is that this shows the impact of globalization, which is a part of your GS1 syllabus. How? Because these one traditional community of traditional craftsmen are now being able to market their produce on some global brands like the IKEA is definitely an impact of globalization. So this can be used as an example or a case study when you're talking about the impact of positive impact of globalization. Second, it also shows the role of NGO, which is a part of your GS paper 2. So in this case, the Industry Foundation, which is an NGO, aims to come out with more sustainable and eco-friendly solutions for various items that we use in our day-to-day lives. So therefore, this NGO is a classic example of a civil society organization that aims to drive home some eco-friendly and sustainable solutions in our day-to-day lives. So this can be used as an example of NGOs while you're writing an answer on NGO as part of your GS paper 2. Third, it is also an example that talks about sustainable development, which comes under your GS paper 3. So in that case, you can use this as an example to show how bamboo can be used as an alternative to various other non-biodegradable and non-eco-friendly forms or things. So how bamboo can supplement or even substitute them, and how bamboo can be used as an eco-friendly and sustainable alternative. So as an example for that, in sustainable development topic of your GS paper 3, this can be quoted as an example. And it also shows how the traditional crafts can be made more remunerative, and they could even be made to reach the global markets. So here the Medar community are the traditional craftsmen who work on bamboo, and this is a classic example of how these traditional crafts can be popularized at the global level, and how it can be even sold on the global brands, so at the world level. So this one example can therefore be used in these 4 different cases, and so kindly note this example down. And mentioning these unique examples will only fetch you that half 1 mark more per question, and that is what will take you at least 10 to 15 mark more per paper, which comes to about 50 to 60 marks when we combine all the GS4 papers. So that can make a huge difference whether you are in the list or out of the list, or whether you are in the top 50, 100, or you get the other ranks. So this is the first topic for today. The second topic we'll be discussing is related to the India-Japan relations. So when we talk of the India-Japan relation, or for that matter, any relation between India and any other country, we will be talking in terms of the strategic or the defense cooperation, then economic and trade relations, and then the relations in science and technology and innovation, then people to people and cultural relations. So therefore, these are the various aspects. So these are the various dimensions which we will be covering as part of an analysis of the international relation between two countries. So when we talk of the India-Japan relation, economic and trade relations are very important in this case. So this is showing an example of how the Japan External Trade Organization, or JETRO, has opened up this, has tried to establish a startup hub in India, and how it has been involved in India to identify those Indian startups which can be helpful in the Japanese markets also. So for that, a startup hub has been established in Bangalore. So this shows the India-Japan relations when we talk in terms of the economy and trade. So we must know that the both countries have what is called as the India-Japan Business Forum, and this forum recently conducted its virtual conference, through which it was decided that we need to encourage more startups. So this startup ecosystem and selecting Indian startups which can work on the Japanese market through the JETRO and setting up of the startup hub in Bangalore, they come under the economic and trade relations between India and Japan. So this is one more aspect that you will have to cover when you are covering the India-Japan relations. Next, we will move on to the third topic, and this is related to the RBI's annual report that has come up. So RBI has come out with an annual report that talks about the status of the Indian economy in the present COVID scenario. So because of the COVID crisis, definitely the economy has shrunk. There is a contraction in the economy. And what the RBI's annual report has pointed out is at least the economy is facing 4 major ills. So let's see those 4 major ills. One is that there is a contraction in the demand, and this is because the private consumption has fallen drastically. So many people have lost jobs, they don't have disposable incomes at hand, and therefore they do not want to spend unnecessarily. So apart from the absolutely essential items, they do not want to otherwise spend. So the level of private consumption has fallen drastically, so thereby the demand in the economy has fallen sharply. This is the first observation that the RBI has made in its annual report. The second is the strained public finances. So definitely with the corona pandemic now raging in the country and so many people who are falling prey to this particular pandemic, the government finances have been stretched, and government has been spending on both the hospitalization, recovery of the people, on the various drug trials that are going on, and also for the welfare and support, economic support to the people in the time of the crisis. So for that, the government finances have also been stretched. So this is the second observation made by RBI. The third is the anemic appetite for investment. So because of the scenario that's prevalent, the investors are not looking for investment in the country. Obviously, because there is no demand, so when the demand itself has slumped, the investors also are not encouraged to invest in the economy. So there is an anemic appetite for investment in the economy. And there is also risk aversion on part of the bankers. The bankers don't want to lend to the investors, lend to the private sector, because they feel that even if they are lending to the private sector, and even if the private sector is investing, because of an overall slump in the economy and a sharp contraction in the demand in the economy, these private investors may not be able to do well. They may run into losses in the future, and whatever amount the bankers have lent to the private sector may eventually turn out to be non-performing assets. So even banks are risk averse and they do not want to lend in the economy. So this has been the overall forecast that the RBI has given for this year. So this is the picture of the Indian economy that the RBI has painted through its annual report for this whole year in India. So with the help of this 4 important forecasts which the RBI has made, we can say that there is an economic contraction in the country. So in order to overcome this contraction, the RBI in its annual report has also made one very important suggestion, which can again be mentioned in your answers. The suggestion says that the government needs to monetize its assets. When we talk of monetizing the assets, it could be the assets that the government has in the steel, coal, power, and even land and railways, which means the public sector, the enterprises that the government owns in the steel sector and the coal sector, the land and the railways. So all of these could be privatized, so thereby monetizing these assets of the government. So this is also the suggestion that the RBI has given in its annual report, that by monetizing the government assets, government can mobilize more resources. So the current strained finances that strain will ease out to some extent. Through monetizing these assets, government will be able to mobilize some resources to tackle the pandemic and also to push for that stimulus in the economy so that the demand picks up in the economy. So this is about the RBI forecast, which talks about the economic impact that the COVID has had and what is going to be the nature of Indian economy in the next 1 year when we talk of its the economic growth. So this whole report is painting the picture of an economic contraction in the coming year, and this is precisely how Indian economy will look like in the coming few years. So this, you can say, these information and this the forecast, the four important forecasts and the economic contraction which the RBI has predicted, this you can use whenever a question is asked on the impact that the pandemic has had on the Indian economy. So in such case, you can take the reference of the RBI annual report, which is the very authentic and authentic one. So you can quote that report, and then you can quote these four important forecasts, which will broadly cover the various aspects of the economy, the impact that the pandemic has had on the economy. So this can be a part of your GS3 syllabus, which talks about the economy and its various dimensions. Now we'll move on to the next topic, and this topic is related to the new education policy 2020 that has come up. So what this article begins by saying is, this article says that the new education policy 2020 is here to do two R's. One is to revise and the other is to revamp. So the new education policy is the aim of the new education policy is to revise and revamp the educational system in India. So the Kothari Commission that was set up way back in 1964 to 66. This Kothari committee had recommended that there has to be a 10+2 system of education. 10 years of the first to 10th standard, and then 2 years, which is an intermediate between the schooling and your graduation courses. So that is like your +1 and +2. So 10+2 system was what was recommended by the Kothari Commission, and now through NEP we are kind of going for a structural change from the 10+2 format to a 5+3+4 format. So in which earlier, when you look at Article 45 of the Constitution and the Right to Education Act, it provides for the right to education starting from the age of 6. But the new education policy clearly lays emphasis on the early childhood education as well, and it lays stress on the education from starting from 3 years itself. And what it calls, the new education policy has given a term for this, which is called as the foundational literacy and numeracy. So earlier, under Article 45 and the right to education, the right actually started for children from the age of 6, but now through NEP we have laid more emphasis on the early childhood education, which starts at the age of 3 itself, and the NEP has given that a term that's called as foundational literacy and numeracy. So basically, for those kids who are between 3 and 6 years of age, they should be able to learn the alphabets, they should be able to write the alphabets, not just recognize them, and also be able to do some basic arithmetic skills. So this is what the NEP means by saying foundational literacy and numeracy. Now, in various articles before, we have analyzed what are the features of NEP, and we have also analyzed what is the importance of NEP, and also a critical analysis of NEP we have already done. So the reason I have picked this up is that this whole article has been written by Krishna Kumar, who is a former director of the NCERT. So whenever you are writing any critical reviews, you can also quote such such famous people, because Krishna Kumar is a former director of the NCERT itself. So you can quote the name of Krishna Kumar, and if you write some critical views that this has been the view of such and such an important person, then that will add more value to your answer. So basically, in this article, Krishna Kumar is focusing on that feature of NEP, which is focusing on the 3 to 6 year age group. So this has been the focus of the Krishna Kumar in this particular article. So what he says is that NEP is focusing on the 3 to 6 year old people, and it is trying to ensure that they have some foundational literacy and numeracy. But however, Krishna Kumar feels that this can have some negative implications as well, because a small child between 3 and 6 years of age, you may make the child to learn or to recognize an alphabet, but the child may not be able to understand the meaning of it. Similarly, you may be able to teach the child to do some basic maths, but the child does not draw any meaning out of it. So this is the concern of Krishna Kumar. If you see here, just read this, you will understand. An introduction to the alphabet and being drilled for letter recognition at a very young age is a major source of reading without deriving any meaning or showing any interest. So basically, the child is going to learn to recognize an alphabet, but the child is not going to derive any meaning out of the alphabet, nor does the child can develop any interest towards it. It is just that the child will be mechanically drilled to recognize a particular alphabet without the child deriving any meaning from it or drawing any interest out of it. So this is one genuine concern of Krishna Kumar, which can be quoted in your answers when you are talking about the critical analysis. One is definitely the 3 to 6 year age group, to which the NEP is introducing the foundational literacy and numeracy, and then you can invoke the Krishna Kumar's views that this can just make the child recognize the alphabets, but then that will be more of a mechanical drilling without the child understanding the meaning of it or even being able to generate interest out of it. So these views you can write of the Krishna Kumar, who is the former director of NCERT. So quoting him, the name of Krishna Kumar in answers is definitely going to add more value to your answers. So this was it in this particular article. Now we'll go on to the next article, which is on agricultural marketing. So this was on agricultural marketing, and first of all, at the outset, this article, this editorial basically lists the various measures that have been taken by the current government to improve the agricultural marketing in India. And at the same time, the article also tells where these initiatives taken before to revamp the agricultural marketing have actually failed and why haven't they taken off much. And then the article also goes on to say that the one reason for all of this, which it calls as the time inconsistency, the phenomenon of time inconsistency, which is a term that is used by behavioral economists. So let's now try to understand this article. So first, the article, as I said, talks about the various measures that the government has taken, and then it talks about the flaws in the implementation as to why these measures didn't take off well. So first is, for instance, the ENAM, the National Agricultural Market, which the government started in the year 2016 itself. So what this aimed was, it aimed to connect the 585 market across the country, and it wanted to bring that together into one grid. So in this, the farmer can quote any price, and whoever the buyer who has quoted the price of the farmer, the farmer can sell the produce to that buyer, no matter where the buyer is actually located. So this helped in a better price discovery for the farmers, and the farmer does not have to distress sell his produce. Rather, he will be able to wait for the kind of buyer who is able to agree to his quoted price. So thereby there is going to be better price discovery for the farmer as well. So this ENAM actually required the state governments to introduce some 3 important changes in their state APMC laws. So the 3 important changes was, one is that there has to be a single license across the state. So the agricultural marketing in India has been so much fragmented that even within the state, to sell the produce of the farmers in a different market, in the market of the neighboring district for instance, another license was required. So like that, the farmers had to juggle with multiple licenses, and multiple times they had to make the payment of the market fee. Apart from that, there were a number of intermediaries, and for each of them the farmer had to pay the commission fees, the agent's fee and all that. So this has led to a lot of fragmentation in the Indian agricultural marketing sector. So what this ENAM initiative told was that the states will need to come out with 3 important changes, and only when these 3 important changes are incorporated in the states, only that the ENAM assistance will be given to them. So the first thing was that the states should have a single license across the state. There has to be a single point levy of the market fee. As I said, that the market fee was levied at different points, and the farmers will have had to pay these fee at different points, which was very much cumbersome for the farmers. So ENAM said that one more prerequisite was a single point levy of the market fee and also electronic auctioning in all the markets. But however, all the states did not fulfill these three prerequisites. So therefore, ENAM as such has not taken off as effectively as it was meant to take off, because the states could not fulfill these three prerequisites that was mentioned as a part of this initiative. So next, PM Asha was launched. So what happened in PM Asha? So PM Asha said that if the farmers are getting, let's say if the farmers sell their produce and they get rupees 50. So whatever is the cost of cultivation, the farmers support will be given to them, which is 50% more than the cost of cultivation. Let's say if the cost of cultivation is 50, then 50% of 50 is 25. So farmers will be given an assistance of 75 rupees. So farmers will definitely get 50%, which is more than the cost of their cultivation. So that will be the return or an assured price to the farmers. So an assured price to farmers that ensure a return of at least 50% more than the cost of cultivation. But however, this initiative was first of all limited. Limited to what? It was limited to just the oil seeds and the pulses, because this definitely had a lot of fiscal costs and the center wanted to limit the fiscal costs. So this whole scheme was made limited to just the pulses and the oil seeds. Second was the issue of deficiency payment. So how was this 50% plus cost, that is cost plus 50%? So how was this to be paid to the farmers? So this was to be paid to the farmers either through public procurement or through private procurement or through deficiency payment. Now deficiency payment means what? If the cost of cultivation is 50 rupees and if the farmer is selling it in the market at 60 rupees, so cost plus 25 comes to 75 rupees, which the farmer should have actually got, but he sold it in the market and he got rupees 60. So this difference is the deficient, is what is deficient for the farmer, and that needs to be paid. So these were the three modalities through which the farmer was to be paid the cost plus 50. That is the public procurement, private procurement, and deficiency payment. Well, public procurement did happen, but private procurement and deficiency payment did not happen as it was envisaged to happen. So even on this front, PM Asha had failed. The third failure of PM Asha is related to the budgetary outlay. So when the PM Asha was actually born, or when it was initiated, the initial budgetary outlay was 4,700 crore that was allocated to PM Asha in 2018-19. But as years progressed, the allocation to PM Asha dropped drastically. Next year, the allocation came to around 300 odd crores, and next year it was just 500 odd crores. So it is said that the budgetary outlay to this scheme has been falling, and it is not sufficient to provide this cost plus 50% support to the farmers as has been envisaged by this scheme. So here you can see it was 321 crore in 1920 and 500 crore for 2021. So the falling budgetary outlay, the less amount of budget being allocated to this scheme was another reason for the scheme being ineffective. So therefore later on we shifted to PM Kisan. So what happened in PM Kisan was just a direct cash assistance that was given to the farmers. So this cash assistance that was given was rupees 6,000 per annum for the whichever family has the land. So they will get a cash assistance of 6,000 rupees per annum. This was the PM Kisan scheme. But however, there were still further criticisms that first of all 6,000 per annum was less, the amount was less, but rather the farmers would actually be spending much more than this. And secondly, this said that 6,000 rupees per annum to those farmers, but how will you recognize who are the farmers, because they will be owning the lands and they will be having their title deeds. But what about the tenant farmers who don't really own the lands, but they are the ones who are working on the lands? So these assistance wouldn't reach the tenant farmers was another criticism of this scheme. So like that, each of these schemes had their own features, but however they proved to be ineffective due to various failures on various parts. So because of all these failures, if you see the measures starting from ENAM till eKisan, ENAM said that it enables the best price discovery for the farmers based on the market prices. So ENAM was basically completely market based, but if you look at the PM Kisan is completely based on public support. So now you analyze the schemes from ENAM till PM Kisan. The schemes have been shifting from market based schemes to public support schemes. So there has been a lot of shift in the schemes, there has been a lot of shift in the policy, and it is very difficult for the investors to predict in which direction will the policy swing, whether it is going to be market based or it is going to be public support based. It is very difficult for the investors to predict as to which direction the policy of the government is going to swing. This is what the article calls, that the behavioral economists call this as time inconsistency. Time inconsistency means that the policy credibility vacillates a lot. It keeps on shifting and keeps on swinging from one end to another end. So in this, the ENAM was market based, and then it shifted to PM Kisan, which was public funded. So because of this inconsistency in the public policy, what do the investors feel? The investors feel that let the government come to a stable policy and then let me invest. So they adopt a wait and a watch approach towards it. So they are not ready to invest in the agriculture sector because they wait that let the government stabilize a particular policy and then let me invest. So because of this huge swing, the private sector or the investors have adopted a wait and watch approach, and because of which the marketing reforms have not taken off to an extent to which it should actually have taken off. Apart from this, there are several other issues as well when we talk of the agricultural marketing. One is the availability of cheap and affordable credit, that is need to set up the marketing infrastructure. Next is the availability of insurance to the farmers, and also the restrictions which are there in several states regarding land leasing. Not all the states have eased their laws related to land leasing, so there are a lot of restrictions in several states on land leasing. These are the other issues which the agricultural marketing in India faces. So all of these are required to be rectified. So overall, this is talking about the various schemes and their analysis, which definitely can come as an independent question about the what schemes have been taken by the government to encourage or to revamp the agricultural marketing in India, and analyze those schemes. So in which case you will write these schemes: PM Asha, PM Kisan, ENAM, and all that. And apart from that, if there is a general question on agricultural marketing and what are the issues with respect to it, one you can say is the credit, other is the insurance, then is there strict land leasing laws in some states, and then is the issue of time inconsistency, or the issue of policies being not predictable. They swim, the policy swinging from being market based to being public funded, and hence the private sector or the investors adopt a wait and watch approach. So this is all about this article on agricultural marketing. Now we'll move on to the next article, which is related to the outer space. So outer space, this article begins by saying that outer space has become a very important area where many countries across the world are sending their various missions that have been planned in the outer space. So in this case, first of all, what is the importance of outer space, and why is it important to look at the governance model for the outer space again, and what are the challenges that we may face if we want to come out with a governance model for the outer space. So this comes as a part of your GS3 syllabus, which talks about science and technology. So in which space technology, the outer space will come under that particular topic. So this article begins by saying that the space market as such is now growing tremendously. So it says that according to a Bank of America report, the space market has been $350 billion in 2020, and it is predicted that this is going to touch nearly $2.7 trillion by 2050. So the space market as such is growing at a very huge pace. So this itself will make this whole subject really very important to consider regarding how the outer space is going to be governed in the future, given that its market is going to be expanding very hugely in the future. Second is the issue of private participation. So earlier it was just the state governments, the states, the different countries across the world that were sponsoring various missions to the space, and they took the responsibility of launching the missions. But now if you have a look across the world, there are several private organizations which are coming up, and they are offering their own space related services. So one example for that could be the SpaceX. So SpaceX is planning this project that's called as Starlink. So under Starlink, the SpaceX wants to give internet access across the globe. It wants internet services to be made available anytime, anywhere. And this it seeks to do by placing nearly 10,000 microsatellites in the low Earth orbit. So this is the dream of a private space agency. So therefore the private's participation in the space sector has increased a lot. Similarly, we have Project Kuiper, and this is a project by Amazon, and this again aims to put microsatellites out there in the orbits for various purposes. So now if we say that the project rather the objects in the space amount to less than the number is less than 3,000, within a decade it's projected that the number of satellites out there in the space is going to be more than 80,000 in number. So this is a very huge number, which explains why the outer space as such needs to be regulated, and we need to come out with a governance model for the outer space. The third reason is a socio-economic development. So satellites are undoubtedly used by the countries for socio-economic development, starting from navigation till the defense purposes. It is used in a wide variety of uses. So, and also the military development. These satellites are also used by the militaries across the world to monitor the movement of the enemy military, and for various other purposes, to know various sensitive locations, etc. The military of a country is also heavily reliant on the satellites which are orbiting the in the outer space. So it's important even for the military of the various countries as well. So all of these points are making the outer space a very valuable space, and also where there are a number of stakeholders who are present apart from the countries. Now there is even the private sector participation, and apart from the socio-economic development, even the strategic and defense capabilities are now relying upon the satellite technologies. So outer space has become a very sensitive issue, and the countries need to collaborate together to come out at a governance model which suits all the countries across the world. But however, if you are planning to come out with this governance model for the outer space, it faces a number of challenges. It's not very easy to come out with a governance model for the outer space that suits all the countries. Now let's explore what these challenges are. First is related to the governance. So when you look at the governance for the outer space, you see that there are too many stakeholders who are there, or the outer space has now been commercialized. It is also crowded, like as we just discussed, how with less than 3,000 objects in the outer space, within a decade it is projected that the number of objects in the outer space is going to be more than 80,000. So therefore we need to develop a multilateral framework for the governance in the outer space. But however, when we look at developing a multilateral framework, this is going to be very difficult, because unlike earlier times, it is not just the nations which are involved, it is also the private sector that is involved, and it is not just the commercial use of the outer space, but it's also the military use of the outer space. All of this makes the governance of the outer space a very difficult one to arrive at. The second is the dispute settlement. We have this Outer Space Treaty of 1967. We already have this treaty, but this treaty being the one that was drafted way back in 1967 did not envisage a point where the outer space would be so much crowded, and even the private sector participation would be there, and lot of stakes of the countries would be involved in the outer space. So this particular treaty being drafted way back in 1967 could not envisage, could not anticipate such a scenario. But now that we have such a scenario, we need to ensure that there is a dispute settlement mechanism among the countries whenever something goes wrong with the space based assets of the countries. So something that India or United States or China puts up as in the form of space based assets like satellites, and there are some issues between them, which means it boils down to some disputes between the two countries. So this Outer Space Treaty of 1967 does not provide for a dispute settlement mechanism. So therefore, we are also required to come out with a dispute settlement mechanism for such scenarios. Third is the private sector role. As we have previously said, that SpaceX and the Project Kuiper of Amazon. So like that, there are several projects which have been now taken up by the private sector, and they are putting a lot of microsatellites in the low Earth orbits. So because of the participation of the private sector itself, it becomes all the more important for us to revamp this governance model, because as we just discussed previously, it was just the states that took responsibility for anything that happened to the space assets in the outer space. But now even the private sector is a dominant player in this particular space. So that